03:10 a.m., October 25, 1942, south of Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The jungle breathed in wet gusts and the ridges sweated rain. Men of the Imperial Japanese Army's 2nd Division, the Sendai, crept up through kunai and tangled roots, bayonets catching a dull glimmer where the canopy bled starlight. They had marched for days to strike the American perimeter in darkness, certain that one more push would break the thin line around the airstrip. Then the night changed shape. A single foxhole on a narrow trail erupted with a sustained mechanical snarl, the flat, relentless chatter of a Browning. 30 caliber M1917A1 heavy machine gun, belt-fed in 250-round loops, water jacket hissing as steam drifted like white breath. The weapon's slow, punishing cadence, about 450 rounds per minute, walked fire across the approach lanes with a precision that felt impossible. Survivors later whispered that an Oni waited there, a demon behind the gun, because no human could keep feeding belts, clear stoppages, and still drag ammunition through that rain of splinters and dirt. By first light, the ridge held the quiet of shock. Powder smoke hung low and sour, palm fronds were shaved to stubble, and the ground before that foxhole looked ploughed. Marine after-action notes and Japanese recollections would never agree on the count, but the bodies lay in rows that told their own arithmetic. Over the pit, the water-cooled Browning's jacket still ticked with heat. In the mud beside it, empty cans, shredded canvas belts, and brass glinted like river gravel. The name the Americans gave the gunner, Sergeant John Basilone of the 7th. Marines meant nothing to the men who had tried this ridge in the dark. To them, the position itself felt haunted, as if the machine gun had outlasted the night by will alone. When the sun edged up over Henderson Field and the echo finally drained from the ravines, the survivors understood only that the path to the airstrip now ran through that single torn patch of jungle. To see how one foxhole became the hinge on which Guadalcanal turned, we have to trace how the Sendai Division found this approach and why the Marines chose to stand here at all. August 7th, 1942, Guadalcanal. Dawn broke not with color, but with smoke. From the decks of U.S. transports off Lunga Point, landing craft churned toward a shoreline still half wrapped in morning fog. The 1st Marine Division, 19,000 strong, moved ashore under Operation Watchtower, the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific War. Their objective was simple in writing yet immense in consequence: capture the unfinished Japanese airfield that dominated the sea lanes between America and Australia. On maps, it was a strategic point. On the ground, it was a furnace disguised as paradise. The moment boots hit sand, the smell of rot, salt and oil fused into a single suffocating breath. Palms towered over brackish swamps, mosquitoes clouded the air like ash, and every step sank into mud that swallowed more than footprints. It devoured morale. By the 2nd week, the Marines had learned what the Japanese already knew. Guadalcanal was not a battlefield. It was an organism, and it consumed everything left upon it. Food spoiled within hours, rifles rusted in their scabbards, the wounded festered before help could reach them. Reinforcements and rations came sporadically, as Japanese destroyers, Tokyo Express, slipped through the night to shell Henderson Field. The enemy, veterans of jungle warfare in Malaya and the Philippines, struck like ghosts. They came, at night in waves, screaming through the blackness with bayonets fixed and bugles blaring. Each assault aimed at slicing through the thin American perimeter. The Marines called those nights Banzai nights, hours when fear and exhaustion blurred together, and no man slept without his finger on a trigger. Among those waiting for the next assault was a 25-year-old gunnery sergeant from Raritan, New Jersey, John Basilone of the 7th Marines. His section had arrived late in the campaign, reinforcing an exhausted line that barely held the airstrip. The men were thin, fevered, and running short of ammunition. Yet as October approached, they dug in along Lunga Ridge, threading belts, into the receivers of their Brownings and stacking ammo boxes in the mud. None of them knew that within days, the Japanese Sendai Division would come for the ridge, and that Basilone's foxhole would become the hinge on which the fate of Guadalcanal turned. John Basilone was born on November 4, 1916, in Buffalo, New York, one of 10 children in an Italian-American family that believed in hard work more than words. His father, Salvatore, a bricklayer from Naples, built his home and his son's discipline from the same raw material: stone, sweat, and silence. By his teenage years in Raritan, New Jersey, John had discovered boxing. The ring became his first battlefield, and the rhythm of fists and footwork his first education in endurance. Local papers called him Manila John, after his bouts with Filipino fighters during his first enlistment in the U.S. Army. He had joined the Army at 20 and served 3 years in the Philippines with the 31st Infantry Regiment, where he learned not only how to fight, but how to survive heat, isolation, and disease. When he returned to civilian life, the quiet of peacetime felt unbearable. The fight had left his hands, but not his spirit. In 1940, restless and seeking purpose, he enlisted again, this time in the United States Marine Corps. Basilone's fellow, Marines would later say he wasn't loud, but his presence steadied a foxhole like a steel beam. He laughed rarely, smoked constantly, and had a boxer's stillness in his eyes, focused, unshaken. Training at Quantico and later on New River, North Carolina, he mastered the Browning machine gun, learning to clear jams and swap barrels in seconds. He carried himself like a man who had already faced defeat once and refused to meet it again. When D Company, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines shipped out for Guadalcanal in late September 1942, Basilone brought with him more than skill. He brought calm, the kind that only comes from knowing what fear looks like and deciding to fight anyway. By October, his unit was ordered to hold the defensive line on Lunga Ridge, the last barrier protecting Henderson Field. The men were worn thin from weeks of rain and hunger, but Basilone drilled his machine gun crews until the night watch felt like reflex. "Hold this line," he told them, "because if we lose it, we lose everything." As the jungle quieted before the coming storm, Basilone settled beside his gun pit, eyes fixed toward the darkness that would soon explode into war. October 24, 1942, Guadalcanal. The rain began before nightfall, heavy enough to drown sound. By 2100 hours, the slopes around Lunga Ridge had become rivers of red clay. In that dark deluge, Major General Masao Maruyama's Sendai Division moved into position, nearly 7,000 men advancing through the jungle in 3 converging columns. Their objective was simple and absolute: seize Henderson Field before dawn and destroy the Marines guarding it. Colonel Shoji Toshinari's regiment, veterans hardened in China's brutal campaigns, took the central approach, aimed directly at the sector held by D Company, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. The men advanced barefoot, bayonets fixed, whispering through bamboo thickets slick with rain. Some carried mortars wrapped in oilcloth, others bore only grenades and rifles. Behind them, officers murmured the Emperor's name. Ahead of them, unseen in the dripping dark, John Basilone waited with 2 machine guns dug into a narrow ridgeline, his field of fire cut by trees and the smell of wet cordite. At 10:30 p.m., the silence broke. A Japanese flare hissed upward, bursting into white daylight over the canopy, and the jungle came alive. From the ridge, Basilone's Brownings opened up, their muzzles glowing in the downpour. Each gun spat, a red chain of traces, into the advancing ranks, cutting men down before they could even level their rifles. The noise was deafening, metal on rain, screams lost to thunder. Within minutes the barrels glowed dull orange. When an ammunition belt ran dry, Basilone leapt from cover, sprinting across open ground slick with mud and blood, arms heavy with new belts. Machine gun crews shouted for rounds, and each resupply meant threading between incoming mortar blasts and rifle flashes that split the dark like lightning. Still, the Sendai came, again and again shouting "Tenno Heika Banzai" as they charged through the storm. Some reached the wire, others fell inches from it. Basilone moved from pit to pit, clearing jams, swapping barrels, and dragging wounded men back by their collars. Hours passed. The ammunition dwindled to scattered boxes. The guns smoked and hissed in the rain. When dawn finally threatened the horizon, half of Basilone's crew were dead or bleeding out in the mud, and the ridge reeked of sweat, cordite, and decay. The Japanese were regrouping for another push, and Basilone, soaked, blistered, and unflinching, knew the night's horror was far from over. Midnight, October 25, 1942. The rain had thinned to a mist, but the battle had become a nightmare stripped of shape or order. The ridge was a furnace of smoke, mud and blood where men fought at arm's length, shadows lit by the flicker of gunfire. Sergeant John Basilone's defensive line, once 2 machine guns and a full crew, was reduced to fragments, 2 exhausted men and 1 weapon still breathing. The second Browning lay silent, its barrel warped, its crew dead beside it. The ammunition belts were scattered across the trench, half buried in the bodies of the fallen. When the surviving gun jammed, Basilone crawled forward through the corpses, the stench of blood and oil rising around him, and worked the feed mechanism with fingers burnt raw from the heat. The water jacket hissed like a kettle. Steam rolled off the gun as if it were alive. With no one left to cover the flanks, Basilone filled the void himself. He fought with his Colt M1911 pistol and grenades, moving between foxholes that no longer answered. The Japanese surged again, hundreds strong, charging through the mud with cries of "Tenoheika Banzai" that cut through the thunder like a prayer. They came so close that bayonets struck the sandbags at the lip of his pit. Basilone's Browning roared back, 450 rounds a minute of pure defiance. The weapon's traces stitched red fire across the jungle floor, and every burst revealed the torn silhouettes of men falling into the muck. When a mortar shell landed nearby, killing his last assistant gunner, Basilone was alone. Yet the gun did not fall silent. He fed it by hand, belt after belt, until there was no more to give. The fight lasted through the black hours into dawn. The ridge steamed beneath the first light, heavy with cordite and the smell of decay. Hundreds of bodies lay tangled in the undergrowth, rifles dropped mid-charge, helmets half buried in the mud. Marines who later arrived to reinforce the line would say they found Basilone standing in silence, drenched, deafened, his hands blistered and blackened from the gun. Around him were the dead of an entire regiment. He had not just held the line, he had defined it. What followed that morning would stun both friend and foe, the true measure of what one man's stand had cost and what it had saved. Dawn crept over Lunga Ridge on October 25, 1942, revealing a landscape no artist could have imagined. The rain had stopped, but mist clung low to the ground, swirling around heaps of bodies and twisted metal. When reinforcements from the 7th Marines climbed the slope, what they saw left even veterans speechless. Dozens of machine guns lay shattered, their barrels split open from overuse. Shell casings blanketed the mud like scales of brass, and the smell of burnt oil, blood, and jungle rot hung thick in the humid air. Amid it all stood a single Marine, his face smeared black with soot, his hands blistered, his uniform torn to rags, still gripping the smoking receiver of his Browning. For nearly 24 hours, Sergeant John Basilone had fought without food, without sleep and without relief, firing until the gun nearly fused into one piece of molten steel. Around his position lay the cost of defiance. More than 3,000 Japanese troops from the Sendai Division, many of them from Colonel Shoji's 2nd Infantry Regiment, carpeted the slopes in death. Officers who survived limped back into the jungle, their diaries later recording disbelief, entries that spoke of American demons who never sleep, and machine guns that never stopped breathing fire. Henderson Field still stood, its runways cratered but intact, its flag still flying. The airstrip had survived because one man and a handful of Marines had refused to yield even when reason demanded it. The victory at Lunga Ridge marked the end of Japan's last great push for Guadalcanal. In the days that followed, word of Basilone's stand spread like wildfire through the division, then across the Pacific. His name became a rallying cry whispered in mess tents and on transport decks, the Marine who fought a regiment alone and lived. Back home in America, newspapers would soon turn that whisper into legend. When the battle reports from Guadalcanal reached Washington, the story of Sergeant John Basilone defied belief. Eyewitness accounts from Lunga Ridge spoke of a lone Marine who had held back an entire regiment, his machine gun roaring through a night when the line should have broken. On February 1, 1943, the United States government made it official. Basilone would receive the Medal of Honor, the first enlisted Marine to earn it in World War II. The citation praised his dauntless Courage and gallant fighting spirit in the face of hopeless odds. Yet when journalists asked him about it, Basilone brushed it off. "There were 10 better men who didn't make it home," he said quietly. To him, the medal weighed less than the memory of those who had fallen on the ridge. The Marine Corps, however, saw in Basilone more than a soldier. They saw a symbol. He was ordered home to lead war bond tours, to show the public that the fighting spirit of Guadalcanal was alive in every Marine. He marched down streets lined with cheering crowds, ticker tape falling like snow. His name on posters beside slogans urging Americans to buy bonds. Women pinned flowers to his uniform. Children reached out to touch the man who had stopped a Japanese regiment. Yet behind his calm smile, Basilone felt out of place. The applause sounded distant, hollow, an echo that didn't belong to him. He was a fighter, not a figurehead, and every parade only reminded him that his brothers were still bleeding in the Pacific. By 1944, he could stand it no longer. He wrote to his superiors, requesting combat duty again. Against all advice, his request was approved. Soon, the man who had become a legend on Guadalcanal was heading back to war, this time to an island called Iwo Jima. By late 1944, John Basilone could have spent the rest of the war in comfort. He had been offered a commission, a stateside training post, and the promise of safety. Yet the man who had survived Guadalcanal could not bear the applause of peace while others marched back into fire. "I'm just a plain soldier," he told one interviewer before shipping out again. That December, he joined the 5th Marine Division, assigned to the 27th Marines, where he trained young recruits, many barely out of school, for what would become the bloodiest assault in Marine history. Their target was Iwo Jima, a small volcanic island halfway between the Marianas and Tokyo, fortified by nearly 21,000 Japanese defenders under General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. The invasion was scheduled for February 1945, and Basilone knew this time the enemy would not break. On the morning of February 19th, as landing craft nosed toward the black sand beaches, the sky shimmered with smoke and cordite. Basilone's unit hit Red Beach 2, where Japanese machine guns raked the shoreline from hidden bunkers carved into Mount Suribachi's cliffs. The air was a storm of sand, lead, and sulfur. Without hesitation, Basilone charged forward through the barrage, spotting a concrete blockhouse pinning down the assault. He crawled to within yards of it, lobbed grenades through its firing slit, and silenced the position in a blast that shook the beach. Moments later, he saw a tank trapped and burning, its crew screaming for help. Through gunfire and smoke, Basilone ran to them, guided them out, and pushed the survivors toward cover. As he turned to rally his men, a burst of enemy mortar fire struck nearby. Basilone fell instantly, killed before anyone could reach him. His final actions opened the path for his company's advance, saving countless lives in the first brutal hours of Iwo Jima. The man who had once stood alone on Guadalcanal had fallen leading from the front, his life bookended by courage under fire. What remained was not silence, but the echo of a legend that even his enemies came to respect. Long after the guns fell silent on Guadalcanal, the men who had survived the Sendai Division's assault carried memories they could not shake. Among the Japanese diaries captured in the weeks following the battle were lines written in disbelief, accounts of a single American who fired like 10 men, who did not tire, did not fall, and did not fear death. One soldier called him the ghost with the iron hands. Another, wounded and left behind, scribbled that the machine guns never stopped, even when the voices stopped. For soldiers raised in the imperial creed that death was duty and endurance was honor, the idea that one man could hold back an entire regiment seemed almost supernatural. They had been taught that Americans were soft, undisciplined, and incapable of true sacrifice. Guadalcanal shattered that illusion in blood and thunder. What Basilone accomplished on Lunga Ridge was more than a defensive victory. It was psychological warfare of the purest kind. The Sendai Division's veterans returned to Rabaul and Bougainville, whispering stories that their officers could not suppress. The legend spread through camps as a caution. The Marines do not surrender. Even Japanese commanders, steeped in the Bushido Code, privately acknowledged a new respect for the American will to fight. Historians later argued that such encounters began to erode Japanese confidence in the inevitability of victory. Basilone's stand was proof that the enemy was no longer the one they had met in China or the Philippines. These new foes fought with the same fatal resolve they once claimed as their own. For the Marines, Basilone's defiance became both shield and sword, a story that fortified morale across the Pacific. The US military seized on it, printing his face on posters, films, and radio scripts as the living embodiment of courage under fire. The man who had been called a demon by his enemies had become a legend among his own. By the spring of 1943, John Basilone's name had traveled farther than any radio signal. Across the Pacific, from the Solomons to the Gilberts, his story spread through whispers, retellings, and campfire boasts. Marines preparing for new landings on Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu spoke his name as if it were armor. Be like Basilone became more than encouragement. It was an unspoken creed. In training camps from Camp Pendleton to Paris Island, instructors recited his stand on Guadalcanal as the perfect lesson in endurance. 1 man, 2 guns, and a night that refused to end. For the next generation of Marines, his Medal of Honor was not just an award. It was a benchmark of what courage under fire meant when the world was burning. The US military quickly recognized the power of his legend. Posters across America bore his face, framed by bold letters urging enlistment and sacrifice. Newsreels and radio broadcasts recounted his heroism, describing him as the Marine who stopped a regiment. Basilone became both symbol and strategy, a living myth crafted to harden morale and inspire conviction. Even President Roosevelt cited his example in speeches meant to rally a weary nation. Yet among those who had fought beside him, the myth rang hollow. They remembered not the propaganda figure, but the man who carried ammunition through mud, who spoke softly before a fight, who shared his last cigarette with a frightened private. In the crucible of total war, heroism became both a weapon and a weight. Basilone's story reminded the Marines that valor could inspire legions, but it also demanded a price. His life, brief and blinding, became the pattern for how the Corps would define courage ever after. Through him, the Marine identity was cast in fire. No retreat, no surrender, no man left behind. When the smoke cleared over Lunga Ridge, military analysts quickly realized that Sergeant John Basilone's 24-hour stand had done more than repel an assault. It had rewritten the principles of small unit warfare. In the dense, chaotic terrain of Guadalcanal, where visibility rarely exceeded 20 yards and radio contact often failed, survival depended not on numbers but on initiative. Basilone's defense exemplified the new kind of warfare the Marines would come to master: fluid, flexible, and fiercely independent. His interlocking fields of fire transformed a single ridge into a fortress, while his disciplined control of ammunition, rationing each belt, clearing jams under pressure, and redistributing rounds between positions, turned scarcity into strategy. Even as his machine guns fell silent one by one, his decision to shift between them maintained an illusion of strength that broke the rhythm of the Japanese advance. Guadalcanal revealed that small, cohesive teams led by decisive non-commissioned officers could achieve results once thought possible only through massed firepower. The Marines began to codify these lessons into doctrine. Training at Camp Pendleton and on Espiritu Santo soon emphasized improvisation, initiative, and the use of terrain as a weapon. Future island campaigns, from Tarawa to Okinawa, would depend on those principles: decentralized command, individual judgment under fire, and the trust between men that no written order could replace. The Japanese, by contrast, clung to rigid tactics that exalted sacrifice over adaptation. The Sendai Division's relentless frontal charges, heroic but futile, became symbols of a doctrine unable to evolve. American analysts later used Basilone's engagement as a case study in tactical evolution, a night when flexibility triumphed over fanaticism. From that chaos emerged a pattern that would define the remainder of the Pacific War. Battles won not by sheer might, but by the courage and quick thinking of small groups led by men who refused to break. The victory at Guadalcanal was more than a hard-won patch of jungle. It was the moment the Pacific War turned. For the first time, the Imperial Japanese Army had failed to seize and hold a strategic objective, and its aura of invincibility cracked under the weight of exhaustion and attrition. The months-long campaign, fought through monsoon rains, malaria, and starvation, tested both sides beyond endurance. Yet it was the Americans who held. The heart of that endurance beat on nights like October 24-25, 1942, when Sergeant John Basilone and a handful of Marines refused to yield. His stand on Lunga Ridge was not the largest or longest battle of the campaign, but it embodied its essence: tenacity against impossible odds. Every bullet fired from his Browning helped preserve Henderson Field, the single lifeline that gave the Allies control of the skies. With the airstrip secure, American fighters and bombers gained dominance over the slot, cutting Japanese convoys to pieces and starving their garrisons into retreat. By February 1943, Tokyo ordered a full evacuation of Guadalcanal. The dream of pushing the Allies from the South Pacific had died in that fetid jungle, replaced by a grim new reality. The Japanese were now fighting a defensive war. For the United States, Guadalcanal was proof that its citizen soldiers could master jungle warfare, endure deprivation, and outfight the empire that had once seemed unstoppable, in every sense: tactical, psychological, and strategic. Basilone's Night of Fire symbolized that reversal. His courage became shorthand for the moment when initiative shifted permanently to the Allies. From then on, the Pacific Campaign would move north and west, toward the Philippines, toward Iwo Jima, and finally toward Japan itself. The ridge he defended was more than ground. It was the threshold of victory. When the guns finally fell silent and the Pacific faded from flame to memory, John Basilone's name refused to fade with it. Across America, his story took root not as myth but as moral compass. Streets, schools, and monuments bore his name, from Raritan, New Jersey to Marine bases across the country. The destroyer USS Basilone, DD-824, carried his legacy across the world's oceans. Its crew reminded daily of the man who had stood his ground against a regiment. Each year his hometown still gathers for the Basilone Memorial Parade, a tradition that began in grief and endures in pride. Children march beneath banners carrying his face. Veterans salute not a ghost, but a brother whose courage became part of their own. Within the Marine Corps, Basilone became the embodiment of three words every recruit learns on day one: honor, courage, commitment. His story was retold at boot camps, his name engraved on the walls of classrooms, where young Marines studied not just tactics, but spirit. To them, he represented the perfect balance between ferocity in battle and humanity in duty. He never glorified killing, only the necessity of standing firm when others could not. His widow, Lina Riggi Basilone, a Marine sergeant herself, never remarried. When asked why, she simply said she had already met her hero. Through her quiet devotion, his story endured not as tragedy but as testament. Basilone's defiance on Guadalcanal and his sacrifice on Iwo Jima became more than episodes of war. They became the measure of what one person, bound by duty and conviction, could achieve. His legacy was not written in medals or parades, but in the hearts of every Marine who followed. Rain falls softly now over Guadalcanal, beading on the palms and whispering through the same ravines that once thundered with gunfire. The jungle has healed, its vines curling over rusted helmets and silent foxholes, erasing the scars of war, but not the memory of what happened there. Beneath this quiet canopy lies the ground where one man stood his ground against a regiment and refused to fall. For the Japanese who survived, it became a haunting legend, proof that even in the blackest night there existed men who could not be broken. For the Marines who followed, it was something deeper, the living heartbeat of their creed, the belief that no line, however thin, would ever give way while a Marine still breathed. Sergeant John Basilone never sought fame or immortality. He fought for the men beside him, for the fragile hope that Henderson Field would still be standing when the sun rose. In that unrelenting night, amid rain and fire, he forged a story that transcended the battle itself, a story of courage, sacrifice, and the quiet defiance that outlives war. Now, as dawn light filters through the trees, the jungle stands still again, indifferent yet eternal. But somewhere beneath its roots lies the echo of that stand, the echo of one man, one line, one night that altered the course of a war and defined forever what it meant to be a Marine.